Margaret Calloway drove the needle through a stranger's torn flesh with steady hands while he lied straight to her face about his name. She knew he was lying. He knew she knew. Neither of them said a word about it because the blizzard outside had already made the decision for them both. They weren't going anywhere until morning. And the truth could wait as long as the wound couldn't. What she didn't know yet was that the man bleeding onto her last clean cloth was the same man who had watched her walk 6 miles through a Montana snowstorm and done nothing to stop her. She would find out. And when she did, everything he'd built was going to burn. Stay with me until the very last word of this story. Hit that subscribe button right now so you never miss what comes next. And drop your city in the comments below. I want to see exactly how far this tale travels. The telegram arrived on a Tuesday. 4 lines. No signature. Margaret Calloway read it once, folded it, and put it in her coat pocket. Then she went back to making bread for a family that wasn't hers, in a kitchen that wasn't hers, in a life that had never fit her right. And she did not allow herself to feel a single thing about it until the dough was finished and her hands were clean. Then she went upstairs, sat on the edge of the narrow bed that her sister-in-law Frances referred to as the guest room, with a particular emphasis that made clear guests were expected to remain temporary, and she read the telegram again. Miss Calloway, stop. Delayed at ranch. Stop. Take the stage from Bridger Creek Station to Harte property. Stop. Someone will meet you. Stop. No name. No apology. No explanation for why Samuel Harte, the man who had written her 17 letters over 4 months, careful and specific, and more honest than anything she'd read since her father's medical journals, couldn't put his own name at the bottom of 4 lines. Meg folded the telegram a second time and held it in both hands. Then she stood up and started packing. Frances found her an hour later, halfway through the carpetbag. "I heard about the telegram." She stood in the doorway with her arms crossed, wearing the expression she deployed when she had decided to be kind about something unkind. "Thomas and I were talking. There's still time to reconsider. Montana territory in October, alone, for a man you've never—" "I've already sold my furniture," Meg said. "We could find you a position here, something suitable. A lady shop, perhaps, or—" "Frances." Meg stopped packing and turned around. Her hands were steady. Her voice was steady. 3 years of hospital work had taught her that steadiness was a choice you made before the crisis, not during it. "I spent 3 years keeping men alive on cots, while doctors with half my skill took credit for it. The hospital board gave me a certificate last spring and told me my abilities were impressive for a woman." She picked up her father's medical bag. Worn leather, brass clasps, the one thing she'd refused to sell. "I'm going to Montana." Frances opened her mouth. "The bread needs 20 more minutes," Meg said, and finished packing. She left Thursday morning. Her brother Thomas shook her hand at the station, which told her everything about what she'd been in that house. Not a sister, a guest, an obligation that had finally, mercifully, resolved itself. The train took 4 days. The stage from Bozeman was supposed to take 6 hours. The wheel spoke snapped at mile 9. The driver, Putnam, a weathered man who looked like he'd personally weathered every bad decision Montana had ever made, gave her the news with his hat in his hands and the particular weariness of a man who'd had this conversation before. Broken spoke. Couldn't move until morning. Trading post, a 1/4 mile east. Meg looked at the sky. It was the yellow-gray of serious weather coming fast. She'd grown up reading her father's barometer. She didn't need one now. "How far to Bridger Creek?" she asked. "Miss, how far?" 6 miles, but that sky says snow inside 2 hours. and the trail follows the river, and there's a fork 2 miles out, and if you take the wrong, which fork do I take?" Putnam stared at her. "The left one. But miss, I cannot in good conscience allow—" "You're not allowing me anything, Mr. Putnam." She picked up both bags. "You're fixing a wheel. I'm keeping an appointment." The storekeeper at the trading post. Iron-haired, efficient, the kind of woman who'd survived decades in this country by wasting nothing, including words, set coffee in front of her without being asked, and handed her a piece of jerky as she walked back out into the cold. "Left fork," the woman said. "Left fork," Meg confirmed. Stubborn woman. "Yes, ma'am." She walked into the October afternoon with her father's medical bag in one hand and her carpet bag in the other. And she counted her steps the way her father had taught her. And she did not look at the sky again because she already knew what was coming. And knowing it twice wouldn't make it slower. The snow started at mile 2. Not gentle. Montana didn't do gentle in October. This was sideways and immediate. The kind that found the gap between your collar and your neck and packed itself there with cold intention. Meg pulled her collar up, ducked her chin, and kept walking. Left fork. River to her left. Count what you can control. She almost missed him. The wind had been making her eyes water for 20 minutes, which meant she was blinking against it constantly, which meant she nearly walked past the dark shape in the snow before something stopped her. Not a sound. More like the absence of one. A shape that was wrong for the landscape, too deliberate for fallen timber. She turned. A man was on his hands and knees in the snow beside a collapsed section of fence. One arm braced against the frozen ground, the other pressed hard against his left side. Big man. Even folded over like that, she could see the width of him, the quality of his coat. Torn now at the shoulder, dark with something that wasn't snowmelt. The fence post beside him had come down with the cable still attached, the wire curled around his torso like it had tried to finish the job. Meg dropped to a crouch beside him before she'd made a conscious decision to stop walking. "Hey, look at me." His head came up. Gray eyes, pale as January sky, sharp as broken glass, focused on her with an intensity that hit her like cold water. Because it wasn't the unfocused look of a man in shock. It was the look of a man who recognized her, which was impossible, because she had never seen this face in her life. The moment passed in less than a second. Pain replaced whatever had been there. What happened? She already had her medical bag open. Fence cable snapped. His voice was deep, rough with pain, controlled in the way of a man who'd decided a long time ago that showing pain was a luxury he couldn't afford. Caught me on the rebound. He tried to push upright, and the sound he made told her exactly which ribs and approximately how many. "Stop!" Her hand went to his shoulder. Not gentle, firm. The firm pressure of someone who needed him to stop, because stopping was the correct medical decision, not because she was asking politely. "Don't move until I know what's moving." "Did the post hit your head at any point?" "No." "Did you lose consciousness?" "No." "Any pain that feels different from the ribs? Deeper? Farther in?" He took one careful breath, assessing. "No." "Good." She'd already opened his coat where it was torn. The gash on his left side was bad, 4 inches at least, deep, ragged, but not arterial. The bleeding was slowing in the cold, which meant it would reverse fast once he was warm. She pulled cloth from her bag. "Hold this, hard. Don't be polite about it." She guided his hand to the wound, and he pressed down without argument, which told her the pain was bad enough that stubbornness had temporarily yielded to sense. She ran both hands along his rib cage with practiced efficiency. He went very still. 2 broken ribs, possibly 3. The angle of his breathing said none had shifted toward the lung. Not yet. "You've had broken ribs before," she said. It wasn't a question. "Once or twice, then you know better than to be out here alone working fence lines in October." "It's my—" He stopped. "I work this range." She looked up. "Your name?" The pause before he answered was brief, less than a second. But she'd spent 3 years watching men decide what to tell doctors and what to keep back, and she knew the shape of that pause. "Cole," he said. "I work the Harte Ranch." "Cole." She held his gaze for one moment, reading him the way she read vitals, quick, thorough, without revealing what she found. Then she stood. "There's a line shack north of here. Can you walk a quarter mile?" "Yes." "That's not a confidence question. That's a structural question. Can your ribs support—" "I can walk," he said, and the edge in his voice was the particular edge of a man who found his own limitations deeply offensive. "Then get up slowly, and let me help without making it a negotiation." He got up slowly. She got her shoulder under his arm, and he took enough of the assistance to make movement possible, without taking enough to feel like he was being carried, which, she suspected, was the closest thing to gracious he was capable of in this condition. They moved north through the snow, in the uneven rhythm of two people learning each other's weight, without discussion. He didn't talk during the walk. She appreciated that. Men who talked when they were hurt usually did it to reassure themselves, and she had no patience for reassurance, his or her own. The line shack was small and cold and solid. Someone had built it to last, which in Montana meant they built it to survive being tested. Dry wood stacked beside the stove, basic supplies on the shelf, 2 bunks, 1 chair. Meg had the stove going before he'd finished lowering himself onto the lower bunk. "Coat off," she said. "Miss, I've sutured wounds in a hospital ward with 14 men watching. Take the coat off, Cole." He took the coat off. The shirt beneath was stuck to the wound, which she dealt with without ceremony and without looking at his face during it, because men who were managing pain poorly needed the dignity of not being watched while they managed it. When she finally had the wound clean and her needle threaded, she glanced up. He was watching her with an expression she didn't have a category for yet. "This will hurt," she said. "I expect so." "Talk. It helps anchor you." "What do you want me to say?" "Anything true," she said, and made the first stitch. His jaw tightened. The muscle in it worked twice. Then, carefully, "What's your name?" "Margaret Calloway. Meg." She made the second stitch. "Your turn." "Cole is sufficient for now." She glanced up briefly. He met her eyes and held them, steady and deliberate, and hiding something she couldn't yet name. She went back to the stitching. "Where are you from originally?" "East. Long time ago." "Family?" "A sister. She manages the—" He stopped. "She's nearby." Meg noted the correction, filed it. "What brought you west?" "Work. Land." A pause. "The usual reasons men come here. Running toward something or running from it." His eyes were on her hands, watching the sutures with attention that went beyond distraction. "You do that like you've done it 1,000 times." 800 at least. She tied off the last stitch. "Your ribs are going to be the real problem. Nothing I can do about broken ribs except tell you not to be stupid with them, and I suspect that instruction has limited historical effectiveness with you." Something moved at the corner of his mouth, almost a smile. "Limited," he agreed. She pressed clean cloth over the sutured wound and began taping it. Is there someone at the main house who'll come looking for you tonight? In the morning, if I don't return. The foreman knows my route. Meg sat back in the chair and looked at him directly. The stove was pushing real heat into the small space now. Outside, the snow was coming hard and steady against the single window, and the light through it had gone gray and final. They were here until morning. That was simply what was true. Where were you headed? Cole asked. Before you found me. Harte Ranch. The silence that followed was different from the previous ones. Heavier. She watched him absorb it. What business do you have at Harte Ranch? His voice was careful. Too careful. I was sent for, Meg said, by the owner, Samuel Harte. He said nothing. She continued. We've been corresponding for 4 months. He asked me to come to Montana to discuss a possible arrangement. She kept her tone practical, because practical was the only register she trusted when discussing this particular subject with a stranger. I was on the stage. The wheel broke. I walked. You walked, Cole said. 6 miles. In this. Closer to 4.5 by the time I found you. Because you had an appointment. Yes. He looked at her for a long moment. Then, quietly, what do you know about him? Harte. I know his letters. She folded her hands in her lap. I know he started with nothing and built something. I know he asked me what I was capable of, not what I looked like. I know he said he wanted a partner, not a portrait. She paused. I know people reveal themselves in what they choose to ask. And what he chose to ask suggested a man who understood that loneliness has a specific texture when you're surrounded by work and nothing else. Cole was very still. And you believed him, he said. Not accusatory. Something stranger than that. I believed he meant it when he wrote it, Meg said. Whether he means it now is what I'm going to Montana to determine. That's a careful distinction. I'm a careful person. She met his eyes. You work for him. What's he actually like? Not the polished version, the real one. Cole was quiet long enough that she thought he might not answer. When he did, he chose each word with unusual deliberateness for a man with broken ribs in a snowstorm. He's hard. On the land, on the people who work it, on himself most of all. He built everything he has with his own hands, and he doesn't forget it. Sometimes that's admirable, and sometimes it makes him rigid. Another pause. He's been hurt before, made him cautious in ways that aren't always fair. Cautious how? He doesn't trust easily. When he decides to trust, he commits completely. When that trust gets broken, Cole stopped. Something crossed his face. It broke something in him that hasn't healed right. His first marriage, Meg said. Cole looked at her sharply. He mentioned it, she said, briefly. Said he'd made a mistake trusting the wrong person, and it had cost him more than money. She held Cole's gaze. I respected that he told me. Most men wouldn't. Most men don't put that in a letter to a woman they're trying to impress, Cole said, and there was something raw in his voice now. Something he hadn't entirely meant to let through. No, Meg agreed. They don't. She tilted her head. Does he know how to apologize? When he's wrong? The question landed in the small, heated space between them, and sat there. Cole looked at her the way a man looks at something that has just said something he wasn't expecting, and isn't sure yet whether to be grateful for it or afraid of it. Why does that matter? Because everyone is wrong sometimes. The question is what they do about it. A man who can't apologize is a man who needs to be right more than he needs to be good. She kept her eyes on his. Is he good, Cole? Not successful. Not capable. Good. The word seemed to cost him something. When he answered, his voice was quiet. He's trying to be. Trying, Meg said. That's the most honest answer you've given me. Something in Cole's jaw tightened. He looked away. The first time he'd broken eye contact since she'd found him in the snow. Outside, the wind gusted, and the shack creaked against it, and Meg watched the side of his face and thought about 17 letters and a man she'd never met, and the specific courage it took to put something true on paper and send it to a stranger. "What will you do," Cole said to the window, "if he's not what you expected?" "Depends how far off he is." She pulled her book from the carpet bag. Shakespeare, her mother's, the spine cracked from decades of use. "If he's better than expected, I'll tell him so. If he's worse, I'll tell him that instead, and we'll figure out what to do from there." She opened to the middle. "I didn't come 2,000 miles to be polite, Cole. I came to see what was actually true." He turned back. Those gray eyes settled on her face and stayed there with an attention that was starting to feel less like a man passing time and more like a man memorizing something he was afraid he was going to lose. "You're not at all what I—" He stopped. "What?" "Nothing." His voice was rough. "Get some rest if you can. Morning comes early out here." Meg looked at him over the top of her book. He was staring at the stove now, jaw set, hands still in his lap, the picture of a man doing battle with something inside himself that he hadn't yet decided how to surrender to. She read 2 pages and understood none of them. "Cole?" "Hmm?" "When the riders come from the ranch in the morning," she kept her voice even, "will you tell them who I am, so they can send word ahead?" The pause was the longest yet. "Yes," he said. "I'll tell them exactly who you are." Something in the way he said it made her lower the book. He wasn't looking at the stove anymore. He was looking at her, and his expression had changed into something she didn't have a name for yet. Not guilt, not exactly, but the close cousin of it. The look of a man who has realized the distance between who he is and who he intended to be, and found it wider than he thought. "Get some rest, Miss Calloway," he said quietly. "Tomorrow's going to be a complicated day." Meg held his gaze for 3 full seconds. Then she went back to her book. She didn't sleep. Across the small, heated space, she was fairly certain Cole didn't sleep either. The storm pressed against the walls of the line shack with the patient, indifferent weight of something that had no interest in either of them. Their secrets, or their silences, or the thing that was building in the cold air between them, like weather of its own. Outside, Montana kept coming. And Samuel Harte, who was not a ranch hand, who had ridden out to this fence line on a gray morning, knowing the stage was delayed, who had watched through field glasses from the ridge as a woman in a gray coat walked alone into a snowstorm, rather than wait because she'd made an appointment and she intended to keep it, sat 3 feet from her in the firelight, and felt the specific, irreversible weight of a man who has made a mistake he cannot yet figure out how to confess. He had wanted to see who she was when no one important was watching. He had seen it. She was exactly who she'd claimed to be. Every word, every letter, every honest, unguarded, precise thing she'd written to him over 4 months. All of it true, all of it real, all of it sitting across from him in a borrowed line shack, reading Shakespeare by firelight. All the storm he'd let her walk into raged against the walls outside. He had wanted to protect himself. He had left her to walk 6 miles alone in the cold to do it. The fire crackled. Meg turned a page, and Samuel Harte looked at the woman he had spent 4 months falling in love with through letters, and understood, with the cold clarity of a man who has just seen himself plainly for the first time in years, that tomorrow was going to cost him everything, or give him the only thing he'd ever actually wanted. The storm kept coming, So did the morning. The morning came gray and quiet, the storm spent, the world outside the line shack buried under 8 inches of fresh snow that made everything look clean and dishonest. Meg was already awake when Cole opened his eyes. She had rebuilt the fire an hour before dawn, boiled water from the snow she'd packed into the tin cup she found on the shelf, and was sitting in the single chair with her hands around the warmth of it when he surfaced from whatever restless half-sleep broken ribs allowed a man. He looked at her immediately. Not the slow, disoriented look of someone remembering where they were. Immediate, direct, like a man who had known exactly where he was every minute of the night. "How long have you been up?" he said. "A while." "You should have slept. You should have been honest about your name." She said it the same way she said everything, level, without decoration. "But here we are." Cole went very still. Meg set down the cup. "The letters," she said. "Samuel Harte wrote 17 of them. I have them memorized well enough that I could recite them in sequence. The third one had a line about how he'd broken his left hand at 19, working a rail line, and it healed slightly crooked, which is why his handwriting angles the way it does." She looked at his left hand, resting on the blanket. "Your handwriting angles that way." The silence in the shack was total. "I didn't know for certain until about 2 hours into the night," she said. "When you talked about the ranch, the water rights, the eastern pasture, the specific problem with the north fence line that you mentioned needed checking before the first hard frost. You wrote me about that fence line in October, 3rd week." She held his gaze. "So, do you want to keep being Cole, or do you want to tell me your name?" Samuel Harte looked at her across the small space and said nothing for a long moment. Then, quietly, "Samuel. Sam. Sam." She nodded once, the way she nodded when a diagnosis confirmed what she'd already suspected. "And you were going to tell me this when, exactly?" "When we got back to the ranch." "And before that? When you watched me walk past you on the ridge?" His jaw tightened. "You saw me. I saw a shape on the ridge that moved with too much purpose for an animal, and too much stillness for a man who didn't know what he was watching for." She folded her hands in her lap. "I assumed it was a ranch hand keeping an eye on the trail. I didn't think it was the man who'd sent for me watching me walk into a blizzard and making a choice not to stop it." "Meg, I'm not finished." Her voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. "You let me walk 4.5 miles in that storm. You let me find you bleeding in the snow, stitch you up, drag you to shelter, spend a night on a cold floor. And you knew. You knew the whole time who I was, and you said nothing." She paused. "I want to understand why. Not the version you've been rehearsing since midnight. The true one." Sam looked at her the way a man looks at a sentence he's been trying to write for years and still can't get right. "My first wife," he said. "I know about her." "You know what I put in a letter. That's not the same thing." He pushed himself upright against the wall, and she saw the cost of it in the compression of his mouth, the deliberate management of breath. Her name was Victoria. She came through Montana on her way to visit family in Oregon, or so she told me. We met at a dance in Bridger Creek. She said all the right things. Said she loved the land. Said she understood work. Said she wanted to build something real. His voice was flat, factual, the way people talked about disasters they'd already spent years processing. I married her 3 months later, gave her access to everything, the accounts, the deed, the decisions. I thought that was what trust looked like, giving someone everything. And she took it. $11,000, the deed to the eastern parcel, 3 horses. She'd been planning it since before she met me. He looked at the stove. Her brother was the con. They'd done it twice before in other territories. I was just the latest man stupid enough to believe a woman who said she loved a thing she'd never actually touched. Meg was quiet. After that, Sam said, I couldn't trust my own reading of people. Every judgment I'd ever made felt suspect. So when I started writing to you, when your letters started to feel real, genuinely real, in a way I hadn't let myself feel in 5 years. He stopped. I got scared. So you decided to test me. I decided to see who you actually were when you didn't know anything was at stake. Everything was at stake, Meg said. My money, my position, my entire future. You just didn't understand that because from where you were standing, only yours mattered. The words landed. She watched them land. You're right, he said, simply and without defense. I didn't think about what it cost you. I was too focused on what it might cost me. That's honest, at least. She stood, picked up her medical bag, checked the contents with the automatic thoroughness of someone who always knew what they had and what they'd used. Your ribs need 3 weeks of limited movement. The stitches should hold if you don't do anything stupid, which based on available evidence seems optimistic. I'll write down what to watch for in terms of infection. She pulled the small notebook from her bag. Is there someone at the ranch who can change the dressing? Meg, I'm writing down the instructions. Will you stop, just stop for 1 moment and look at me? She looked at him. Sam Harte looked back at her, and his face had none of the careful management she'd seen in it all night. No controlled neutrality, no deliberate withholding. Just a man who had run out of distance to put between himself and the thing he'd done, and was standing in the space where it had always been waiting for him. I know I don't have the right to ask you for anything. I know what I did was wrong. But I need you to know that everything in those letters was real. Every word. What I said about wanting a partner, about being tired of building something alone, about recognizing something in your writing that felt like someone who understood what it was to work for a thing and still feel like it was never quite enough. His voice roughened. That was all true. I know it was true, Meg said. That's what makes this harder, not easier. He absorbed that. Outside, they heard it at the same time. Hoofbeats. More than one horse coming from the north. Meg went to the window. 3 riders, picking their way through the fresh snow with the careful confidence of people who knew this land in all its conditions. She recognized the quality of the horses before she could see the faces. Your people, she said. Yes. Sam tried to stand and she was across the room before he'd finished the attempt, her shoulder under his arm, her free hand pressing against his uninjured side. Slowly, she said. And I'm only doing this because you have broken ribs, not because we're settled. I know, he said. And then, quietly, against the top of her head, thank you. She didn't answer. She helped him to the door. The lead rider dismounted before the horse had fully stopped. A woman, Meg realized, compact and efficient in her movements, her dark hair pulled back hard under a wide-brimmed hat. She was perhaps 28, with the kind of face that had decided somewhere along the way that it didn't have time for anything it didn't mean. Her eyes went to Sam first, cataloging damage with the rapid assessment of someone accustomed to it. Then they moved to Meg and stayed there, and the temperature in them dropped several degrees. Sam? The woman's voice was controlled. Marcus has been out since before dawn. I told him you'd taken the north route to check the fence. I did take the north route, Sam said. Cable came down. I can see that. Her eyes hadn't left Meg. Who is this? Dot, Sam said carefully. This is Margaret Calloway. Dot Harte took that in without visible reaction, which was itself a reaction. The particular stillness of someone who had been expecting something and is now recalculating what it means that it has arrived. "The woman from Cincinnati," she said. "Yes," Meg said, "the woman from Cincinnati who walked here from the stage road because someone neglected to meet her." She kept her voice even. "You must be his sister." "I must be." Dot looked at Sam. "You're hurt." "2 ribs. Miss Calloway stitched the cut on my side." "Did she?" Dot's eyes moved to Meg's medical bag, then back to her face. The recalculation was still happening behind her eyes, and it wasn't moving in a friendly direction. "Marcus can take you back on the pack horse. We brought the sled for—" She paused. "We weren't sure what we'd find." "I can ride," Sam said. "You absolutely cannot," Meg said at the same time. Dot looked between them. Something shifted in her expression, minute and controlled, and it wasn't warmth. The second rider had dismounted now. Marcus, the foreman, a weathered man in his 50s, with a face like a topographic map of every hard season he'd survived. He looked at Sam with a particular blend of relief and exasperation that characterized people who cared about someone they also found deeply aggravating. "Boss, you look terrible." "I'm aware, Marcus." "Found her on the trail?" Marcus asked, nodding at Meg with a respect in his bearing that was automatic and genuine. "I found him," Meg said. "He was on his knees in the snow beside a downed fence post. The cable caught him on the rebound." Marcus winced. "How bad?" "2 broken ribs, a 4-inch laceration on the left side that needed suturing, and a night in an unheated shack." Meg looked at Sam. "He'll need the sled." Sam looked like he intended to argue, and then appeared to think better of it, which she suspected had less to do with the ribs and more to do with the fact that arguing with her in front of his foreman and his sister when he owed her a significant debt seemed, even to him, inadvisable. "The sled," he agreed. Dot hadn't moved. She was still watching Meg with that careful, recalibrating attention, and Meg met it directly, because she had learned long ago that looking away from that kind of assessment only confirmed whatever the assessor suspected. "You're coming to the ranch," Dot said. It wasn't an invitation. "I came to Montana to see the ranch," Meg said. "So yes." "You came to marry my brother." "I came to determine whether that was a reasonable possibility. Those are different things, Miss Harte." Meg picked up her carpet bag. "Right now what I came to do is see that he gets transported without aggravating those ribs further. And then I'd like a meal, and somewhere to sit that isn't a wooden floor." Something moved in Dot's expression that might, under different circumstances, have been the beginning of reluctant respect. It didn't stay long. "Get him on the sled, Marcus," she said, and turned back to her horse. The ride to the ranch took 40 minutes through snow-blanketed country that would have been beautiful if Meg had been in any condition to appreciate it. She rode beside the sled, on a bay mare Marcus had brought without being asked, and she watched Sam's face for signs that the movement was worsening the rib situation. And she tried not to think too hard about the fact that she was arriving at the life she'd come 2,000 miles for, on a borrowed horse, in yesterday's clothes, flanked by a man who'd lied to her, and a woman who'd already decided not to like her. The ranch came into view on a rise, exactly as the letters had described. Large, solid, built to last rather than to impress. The main house sat above the valley, with a particular authority of a structure that had earned its position. She could see why a man would love it. She could see why he built his whole identity around it. She could also see, in the way that Dot rode slightly ahead and reached the house first and dismounted before anyone else, what Dot had built her own identity around. A man met them in the yard, tall, lean, wearing a minister's collar over a working man's coat. He had the face of someone who had practiced the expression of concern until it had become indistinguishable from the real thing. His eyes went to Sam, then to Meg, and the calculation in them was faster and less friendly than his smile suggested. "Samuel," he came forward. "Marcus sent word from the Eastern Post this morning. I was worried." His eyes settled on Meg with a warmth that felt tailored. "And this must be the young woman from Cincinnati. We've heard so much." "Reverend Crow," Sam said from the sled, with a flatness that told Meg something. "This isn't the best time." Of course. Crow stepped back, hands raised, accommodating in the practiced way of men who knew how to advance by appearing to retreat. "I only came to make sure you were all right, and to speak with you about the Collins parcel, when you're recovered." He smiled at Meg. "We can be introduced properly another time, Miss Calloway," Meg said. "Miss Calloway." He held her gaze a half-second longer than necessary. "Welcome to Bridger Creek." She nodded once and looked away, because she had nothing else to give him, and she'd been in enough hospital politics to know when a man was taking inventory. They got Sam inside and upstairs, with Marcus on one side and Meg on the other. Dot moving ahead to open doors, her back a straight, controlled line of a woman managing something she hadn't been asked about. Doc Briggs arrived within the hour, a young man, competent, who examined Sam's ribs and the stitching, and sat back and said to Sam, "Whoever did this knew what they were doing." "Miss Calloway," Sam said. Doc Briggs looked at her with genuine interest. "You trained where?" "My father's practice. 3 years at Cincinnati General, though they called me a nurse." They would. He said it without particular judgment, which made her like him immediately. "The suturing is better than mine would have been in those conditions." He packed up his bag. 3 weeks limited movement, Mr. Harte. No riving, no lifting, nothing that involves your torso rotating under load. He looked at Meg on his way out. "If you're staying, Miss Calloway, it would ease my mind to know someone with your skills was on the property." "She's a guest," Dot said from the doorway. "She's staying," Sam said at the same moment. The room held the word. Dot looked at her brother with an expression that had too many layers to read quickly. Then she turned and walked out, and her footsteps down the hallway were measured and deliberate. The walk of a woman who had decided to handle something privately that she didn't want witnessed. Meg looked at Sam. He was watching the doorway his sister had just walked through, with the face of a man who knew a conversation was coming and had no idea how to win it. "She runs this house," Meg said quietly. "She has for 2 years. And she's afraid of what changes when I'm in it." Sam looked at her. "You got all that from 40 minutes?" "I got all that from the way she set her shoulders when Marcus introduced you as my patient." Meg sat in the chair beside the bed. There was one here too, as if houses in this country understood that someone was always going to need to sit beside someone else and wait. "She's not wrong to be cautious, Sam. I'm a stranger who arrived under strange circumstances. Her caution makes sense." "She should trust my judgment." "Your judgment," Meg said, "recently involved watching a woman walk into a blizzard to test whether she was worth talking to." She held his gaze. "Her caution makes sense." He had the particular expression of a man who has been fairly convicted and doesn't have an appeal. "Are you always this direct?" "I spent 3 years in a hospital where being indirect cost people their lives." She folded her hands on her knee. "Yes, I'm always this direct." He was quiet for a moment. Outside the window, the snow-covered valley stretched away to the mountains, and the afternoon light was the specific gold of late autumn in high country. The kind of light that made everything look like it was being seen for the last time. "Meg," his voice was careful. "What I did, watching you, not telling you. I understand if that changes things. I understand if you want to take what I owe you and go somewhere else." He met her eyes. "But I'm asking you not to." "I know you are." "Is there anything I can do? Any way to—" "You can stop asking me to decide something tonight that I'm not going to decide tonight." She stood. "You need to rest. Your ribs need to stay still. And I need to eat something and find out if your sister is going to make this impossible or merely difficult." She moved to the door. "Which do you think it'll be?" he asked. Meg paused with her hand on the doorframe. She thought about Dot's shoulders, her controlled assessment, the intelligence in her eyes that she was using defensively instead of openly. She thought about women who built themselves into the structure of a thing because they had no other way to make themselves permanent. "I think she's scared," Meg said. "And scared people do harder things than cruel people, because at least cruel people know what they're doing." She left him with that, walking down the hall toward the smell of something cooking and the sound of a household that didn't yet know what to do with her, and the specific clarifying knowledge that this was not the worst place she'd ever arrived, and she had no intention of letting anyone make her feel like it was. The kitchen was at the end of the hall. Dot was at the stove with her back to the door. She didn't turn when Meg entered. "Sit down," Dot said. "I'll feed you. That's not optional." Meg sat down. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The stove worked. Snowlight came through the window. Then Dot set a plate in front of her. Solid food. Generous. The cooking of someone who understood that feeding people was a form of authority, and sat down across the table and looked at her with those direct, calculating eyes and said, "Tell me what you actually want here, Miss Calloway. Not what you wrote in your letters. What you actually want." Meg looked back at her. "The same thing you want," she said. "To matter somewhere. To do work that counts." She picked up her fork. "The difference is, I'm not afraid to say it out loud." Dot's eyes narrowed. The calculation continued. Outside, the light was going gold over the valley, and the ranch went on doing what ranches did, indifferent to the particular negotiations of the people inside it. And Margaret Calloway ate her first meal at the Harte table and understood that the hardest thing she'd have to survive here wasn't Samuel Harte's guilt or Reverend Crow's ambitions. It was a grieving woman across a kitchen table who had built her whole life into a house that someone else owned and would not give an inch of it without a fight. Meg took another bite. Good, she thought. She hadn't come 2,000 miles to walk into something easy. The first week at the Harte Ranch taught Meg 3 things about the way a household could be a weapon. The first was that Dot Harte controlled every room she entered, not through cruelty, but through competence so complete and so deliberately demonstrated that any challenge to it felt like ingratitude. She knew where everything was kept. She knew every ranch hand by name and history. She knew the accounts, the suppliers, the seasonal schedules, the particular preferences of the horses, and the particular weaknesses of the fencing on the northwest boundary. When Meg asked a question about the property, Dot answered it accurately and completely, and in a tone that said the answer had always been available to anyone who belonged here enough to ask. The second was that Reverend Crow visited 4 times in 7 days, always with a reason that had nothing to do with his actual reason. Supplies for the church, a message from a neighbor, a question about the Collins parcel that he addressed to Sam and watched Meg during. He was never rude. He was never anything less than warmly ministerial. And every time he left, Meg felt the shape of something she couldn't yet name. The outline of an interest in this ranch that had nothing to do with its souls. The third was that Sam Harte, confined to bed with broken ribs and a guilt he was carrying like additional weight on an already strained frame, was the easiest person in the house to be honest with, which told her something about how the other conversations were going. She changed his dressing every morning, It had become the structure around which the rest of her days organized themselves. Not because she'd been asked to, but because Doc Briggs had confirmed her assessment, and her assessment was that the wound was healing well under her care, and she saw no reason to hand it to someone less qualified. Dot had said nothing about this arrangement. Her silence on the subject was the loudest thing in the house. "It's better," Meg said on the 6th morning, examining the sutured edge with the clean attention of someone who had no investment in the answer being anything other than true. "No sign of infection. The redness is resolved." "You say that like you're disappointed." "I say it like it's what I observe." She applied clean dressing, secured it. "Your ribs?" "Still broken." That wasn't a sympathy question. I know. He watched her work, the way he'd been watching her work all week. With that focused attention, she'd decided, was simply how he looked at things he was trying to understand. "Is Dot speaking to you?" "Dot speaks to me constantly," Meg closed her kit. "She tells me where the linen is kept, and what time meals are served, and which horses have difficult temperaments. She's very informative." "That's not what I asked." "I know that too," Meg sat back. "She's deciding what I am. I'm giving her time to decide." "And what are you deciding about her?" Meg looked at him. "That she's the most capable person in this house, and she knows it, and she's terrified that knowing it doesn't make her permanent." Sam was quiet for a moment. "She's been here since her husband died. She came back because I asked her to help me manage the house after—" He stopped. "After Victoria. She stayed because she was good at it, and because it gave her something to be." He looked at his hands. "I should have thought harder about what I was asking her to give up when I started corresponding with you." "Should have thought harder about several things," Meg said, without heat. "But yes, that one too." He looked at her, with that expression she was starting to recognize. The one where he'd been hit by something fair, and was deciding whether to defend himself or absorb it. He absorbed it. "Are you ever going to stop holding this over me?" "I'm not holding it over you. I'm being accurate." She stood. "There's a difference between punishment and honesty, Sam. I'm not interested in punishing you. I'm interested in making sure we're both seeing the situation clearly." "And are we?" "I'm seeing it clearly." She picked up the kit. "You're getting there." She left him with that and went downstairs where Dot was in the kitchen doing the accounts at the table with the focused efficiency she brought to everything, and where Reverend Crow was sitting across from her with a cup of coffee and an expression of pastoral ease that Meg had learned to read as the resting face of a man in the middle of a negotiation. He looked up when Meg entered. "Miss Calloway, good morning." His smile was immediate and genuine-looking. "I was just discussing with Dorothy the matter of the spring community supper. We usually hold it at the Collins property, but since the sale—" "The Collins parcel hasn't sold," Dot said, without looking up from the accounts. "Not yet," Crow agreed pleasantly. "But when it does, the community will need to think about alternative arrangements." He looked at Meg. "A property of this size would be a natural gathering place, don't you think?" "I think I haven't been here long enough to have an opinion about community suppers," Meg said. She poured coffee from the pot on the stove and remained standing, because sitting down would have been a choice about the shape of the conversation, and she wasn't ready to make it. "But I think the decision about this property's use is Sam's to make." Of course. Crow's agreement was immediate and therefore meaningless, though a man's wife naturally has influence on such decisions. When there is a wife. He looked between Meg and Dot with the unhurried timing of a man who had learned to plant things and wait. "We're all eager to see Samuel settled, of course. He works too hard and carries too much alone." "He carries it well," Dot said flatly. "He does, remarkably well." Crow set down his cup and stood with the easy authority of a man comfortable in rooms that weren't his. "I'll leave you ladies to your morning. Miss Calloway, I hope you'll join us for Sunday service this week. It would give the community a chance to know you." "I'll consider it," Meg said. When he was gone, the kitchen held a different kind of quiet. Dot's pen kept moving across the account ledger. Meg drank her coffee and watched the snowlight come through the window and waited, because she had learned that Dot thought better without the pressure of being watched, thinking. "He wants the Collins parcel," Dot said finally, not looking up. "He's been pushing Sam to buy it for 2 years. Says the community needs the land for expansion. What he means is that if Sam buys it and Crow controls the town council, he controls how it gets used." "And Sam won't buy it?" "Sam doesn't trust anyone who wants something from him that much." Dot's pen stopped. She looked up. A lesson he apparently suspended when it came to correspondence with women he'd never met. It was the closest Dot had come in 6 days to saying what she actually meant. Meg set down her cup. "Say it plainly," Meg said. "I'd rather have the real version." Dot looked at her for a long moment. The calculation in her eyes shifted into something more direct. "You seem capable. You seem intelligent. You handled his injury competently, and you haven't made demands or scenes or caused the kind of disruption I expected." She paused. "But Victoria seemed capable too, in the beginning." "I'm not Victoria." "No, you're a woman from Cincinnati who answered an advertisement and arrived with a medical bag and opinions about everything." Dot's voice was even, but the words had edges. "And my brother, who hasn't let himself want anything in 5 years, has been watching you like you hung the moon since you got here. Which means his judgment is exactly as reliable as it was before, which is to say, not reliable at all." "His judgment about Victoria was wrong," Meg said. "His judgment about me isn't the same judgment." "How would I know that?" "You wouldn't. Yet." Meg pulled out the chair across from Dot and sat down, making the choice about the conversation's shape deliberately. "I'm not asking you to trust me, Miss Harte. I'm asking you to give me enough room to show you something true. That takes time. I understand if you're not willing to extend it." Dot studied her. "And if I'm not? Then we'll be polite and careful with each other indefinitely. And Sam will be caught between us, and the ranch will function, and everyone will be miserable in that specific way that happens when women in close quarters decide not to be honest." Meg held her gaze. "Or we can skip that part." Something happened in Dot's expression that was too quick to read, but too real to miss. "You're very direct. I was trained by a man who believed that imprecision in diagnosis killed people. I've never been able to stop applying it to everything else." Dot looked back at her accounts, but her posture had changed by some small increment that Meg recognized. Not warmth, not yet, but the slight loosening of a person who has decided to keep watching instead of deciding. "The northwest fence needs attention before the next storm," Dot said. "Marcus has been asking Sam to authorize the repair crew for a week, but Sam won't give the order from bed because he wants to inspect it himself first." "Can Marcus make the assessment without him?" "Marcus has been making assessments on this ranch for 12 years. He doesn't need Sam to inspect anything. Sam needs to inspect it." Meg understood. He doesn't want to be useless. He doesn't know how to be anything but the person who decides. Dot's voice had an old, worn quality to it. The way people talked about patterns they'd watched long enough to stop being surprised by. "When Pa died, Sam was 17. He just took over. Everything. There was no space between the problem and Sam solving it." She paused. "I think sometimes he's forgotten that problems can exist without him personally fixing them." "And you've been the one filling the space he couldn't," Meg said. Dot's pen went still. She didn't look up. "Someone had to." The words held more than they said. Meg let them sit. "Tell Marcus he has authorization," Meg said. I'll tell Sam I made the call on medical grounds, that authorizing ranch operations was interfering with his rest. He can be angry with me about it." Dot looked up. The expression on her face was unreadable for a moment. Then, quietly, "He won't be angry with you." "He might be." "He won't." Dot paused. "That's what worries me." She went back to her accounts. Meg finished her coffee. Outside, the ranch moved through its morning with the patient, indifferent rhythm of land that had been worked for years and would be worked for years more, regardless of what the people inside the house decided about each other. She told Marcus at noon. He looked at her with a mild, unsurprised expression of a man who had been waiting for someone to say it. "Yes, ma'am," he said, and went to organize the crew. And that was that. She told Sam at the afternoon dressing change. He was quiet for 3 full seconds, which was Sam's version of a visible reaction. "You authorized that." "On medical grounds. You've been running a low fever since yesterday morning. I didn't mention it because you would have argued, and arguing doesn't reduce fevers." She met his eyes. "Marcus has been making that assessment for 12 years. The fence needed to get fixed. I made a call." "That's my ranch." "Those are your ribs." She secured the dressing. "You can be irritated with me if it helps, but the fence is getting fixed." Sam looked at her for a long moment. She waited for the argument. Instead, he said, "You told Dot first." "Yes." "How did that go?" "She didn't throw me out of the house." Meg closed her kit. "I consider that progress." The edge of his mouth moved. "She likes you. She won't say it yet, but she does." "She's deciding." Dot deciding is Dot liking. She doesn't spend time deciding about people she's already written off. He shifted against the pillows, carefully, the managed movement of a man 3 days from where impatience started winning over sense. "Meg, can I ask you something?" "You can ask." "Are you still thinking about leaving?" She looked at him. He was watching her with the direct, uncalculated attention of a man who had run out of strategies and was asking plainly, which she found she respected more than almost anything she'd seen from him yet. "I'm not planning to leave," she said. "I'm still determining what staying means." "That's not the same as yes." "No, it isn't." She stood. "It's the honest answer, Sam. I thought you wanted honest answers." "I do. I just—" He stopped, looked at his hands. "I'm not good at waiting. I know what I want, and I want to move toward it, and I don't know how to be patient with the distance between where we are and where I—" He stopped again. "I know that's my problem, not yours." "It's our problem," Meg said. "If we're going to build anything, your impatience and my caution are going to have to find a way to coexist." She paused at the door. "But that's a conversation for when you're not running a fever, and I'm not calculating whether your stitches are holding." She was in the hallway when she heard him say, quietly, to the empty room, "I should have met you at the stage." She kept walking, but she stopped at the end of the hall, her hand on the wall, and let herself feel the weight of it for exactly 1 moment. The full, complicated truth of a man saying plainly what he should have done, to a room he thought was empty, because he'd run out of people to perform for. Then she went downstairs. Reverend Crowe was there again. He'd let himself in through the kitchen, which was either customary or calculated, and he was speaking to Dot with the easy authority of someone who had visited often enough to treat the house as semi-public. He looked up when Meg came in. "Miss Calloway, just the person." He had an envelope in his hand. "A letter came to the church addressed to you, from Cincinnati. I offered to bring it out since I was passing." He held it out. She took it, noting the handwriting, her brother Thomas's neat, narrow script. "Thank you," she said. He waited with the particular pastoral patience of a man who expected to be included in whatever the letter contained. Meg looked at him. "I'll read it privately," she said, "but thank you for bringing it." Something moved in his eyes that was there and gone. "Of course." He settled his hat. "I was also telling Dorothy that I've had an inquiry about this property. A developer from Bozeman, interested in the southern parcels. Quite a generous offer." He looked at Meg with the unhurried attention of a man testing a response. "It might be worth Samuel's consideration, given the carrying costs of a property this size." "Sam's not selling parcels," Dot said flatly. "No harm in hearing a number," Crow said pleasantly. "Sam's not selling parcels," Meg said. Crow looked at her. The pleasantness didn't leave his face, but something behind it shifted. A slight recalibration. A man adjusting his assessment. "You speak for Samuel now, Miss Calloway?" "I speak from knowing that a man doesn't work 20 years to build something and then sell the pieces of it from a sickbed." She held his gaze. "If there's a legitimate offer, it'll wait until he's recovered enough to consider it himself. That's 3 weeks. Anyone serious about a real offer can wait 3 weeks." Crow held her gaze for a beat longer than necessary. Then he smiled and picked up his hat and left. And the sound of the door closing behind him had a finality to it that felt less like a departure and more like a repositioning. Dot was looking at her. "He's going to cause trouble," Dot said. "Yes." Meg looked down at the letter in her hand. "He's been causing it quietly. He'll stop being quiet soon." "How do you know?" "Because I just told him that there's someone in this house paying attention." She set the letter on the table and looked at Dot. "And men like that don't adjust their plans. They accelerate them." She opened the letter. Thomas's handwriting was as neat and remote as he was in person. Their cousin's wife had delivered twins. Everyone was well. He hoped she was. And here the handwriting changed fractionally. The way handwriting changed when someone was writing something they hadn't decided to write until they were already writing it. He hoped she had found something worth the distance. She folded the letter and held it in both hands and thought about a narrow guest room bed and a kitchen that had never felt like hers, and a certificate the hospital board had given her with a handshake that said, "Impressive for a woman." And she thought about a line shack in a snowstorm, and a man with gray eyes who'd asked her what she actually wanted and listened to the whole answer. She thought about Dot across the kitchen table, deciding. About Marcus saying, "Yes, ma'am," without hesitation. About Doc Briggs saying, "Your suturing is better than mine would have been." She put the letter in her coat pocket. "Something worth the distance," she said, to no one in particular. Dot looked at her. "What?" "My brother wanted to know if I found something worth the distance." Meg looked around the kitchen, at the solid walls, the working stove, the accounts spread across the table, the window that looked out over land that went on until it hit the mountains. "I'm starting to think I might have." Dot said nothing. But when she turned back to her accounts, the set of her shoulders was different by some small, unmistakable degree. It was not friendship. It was not trust. It was the first, careful, load-bearing thing that came before both, and Meg recognized it for exactly what it was, which was enough. For now, it was enough. 2 weeks into her stay at the Harte Ranch, Meg made a decision that had nothing to do with Sam and everything to do with who she intended to be in this place. Doc Briggs had come out to check Sam's ribs on a Thursday morning, and on his way back through Bridger Creek, he'd stopped at the ranch with his hat in his hands and a look on his face that Meg had learned to read in hospital corridors. The look of a man carrying a problem he didn't have a solution to. One of the homesteader families 3 miles east, the Aldersons, had a child running a fever that had gone into its 3rd day. The mother was managing alone. The father had gone to Bozeman for supplies before the weather turned, and hadn't made it back. "I've done what I can," Briggs said. "But I've got a difficult berth at the Mackenzie place tonight, and I can't be in both locations." He looked at Meg with the directness of a man who had already decided what he was going to ask, and was only working out how to ask it. "I know you're a guest here. I know it's not my place to—" "Tell me the child's symptoms," Meg said. She had her medical bag in her hand before Briggs finished the sentence. Dot appeared in the doorway of the kitchen while Meg was pulling on her coat. She took in the medical bag, the coat, the expression on Meg's face. "The Alderson child," she said. "You knew?" "Martha Alderson sent her oldest boy to the ranch this morning. I was going to ask Marcus to ride out." Dot paused. "I'll come with you." It wasn't an offer. It was a statement. Meg looked at her for one moment and then nodded, because she had learned in 2 weeks that Dot's statements were better accepted than negotiated. They rode out together in the thin winter light, Dot on her own horse and Meg on the bay mare that had become unofficially hers, and the first 10 minutes were quiet in the way their silences had evolved. Not empty, but full of the particular companionship of two people who had decided to be useful in the same direction. "How bad is it?" Dot asked. "Third day of fever in a child is serious. Depends on the cause." Meg kept her eyes on the trail. "How old is the child?" 7. Boy. Henry. "Is he eating?" "Martha said he stopped yesterday." Meg pushed the mare to a faster pace and didn't say anything else, because there was nothing useful to say, and they both understood that. The Alderson homestead was smaller than she'd expected, and better maintained than the size suggested. The particular pride of a family that had very little and kept it precisely. Martha Alderson met them at the door, a woman in her 30s who had the exhausted, careful composure of someone who had been holding herself together through will alone and was very close to the end of her will. "Thank God," Martha said. "Thank God. He's worse since this morning." The boy was worse. Meg could see it the moment she walked into the bedroom. The particular flush and stillness of a child whose body was fighting something harder than it should have to fight alone. She worked quickly, running through everything her father had taught her and everything 3 years in a hospital have added to it, asking Martha questions in a calm, steady voice, while her hands moved with their own trained certainty. Dot stood in the doorway and didn't ask unnecessary questions and handed things when asked, which was exactly right. Lung fever, but early enough, not yet in the stage where the outcome was decided. Meg worked for 2 hours, compresses, the herbs from her bag combined with what Martha had in her kitchen. Careful instructions delivered clearly and repeated until she was certain Martha had them. When she finally stood up straight and looked at the boy's face, the fever had broken its first edge. "He needs watching through tonight," Meg told Martha. "If it climbs again before morning, send someone to the ranch immediately. If it stays where it is or drops, he'll turn the corner by tomorrow." Martha grabbed her hand with both of hers. "I don't know how to—" "You don't need to." Meg held her hands for a moment. "He's going to be all right, Mrs. Alderson. He's strong." On the ride back, Dot was quiet for a mile. Then she said, without preamble, "You were good in there." "It wasn't complicated, thank God. Another day, and it would have been." "I mean, you were good with her." Dot kept her eyes forward. "Martha, you kept her steady without talking down to her." Meg glanced at her. She needed to know her son was going to live. That was the only thing that mattered. Dot nodded, slowly, the nod of someone filing something accurately. They rode the rest of the way in a silence that had changed quality from all their previous silences. Lighter, somehow, by some small but unmistakable degree. Sam was out of bed when they got back. Not dramatically out of bed, not collapsed on the floor, but standing at the window of the study, on the ground floor, in a posture that said he'd been there long enough that the effort of it had gone from conscious to stubborn. And when Meg walked in and saw him, she stopped in the doorway and said, "You have 3 broken ribs and a sutured wound that is 12 days old." 14, he said, "and 2 ribs. Doc Briggs confirmed this morning." Doc Briggs said limited movement, not standing at windows for extended. "I've been in that bed for 2 weeks, Meg." "I'm aware. I've been changing your dressing every day for 2 weeks." He turned from the window to face her, and his expression was the expression of a man who had been alone with his own thoughts long enough that the thoughts had become a structural problem. "Marcus told me about the Alderson boy. How bad was it?" "Less bad than it could have been." She set down her medical bag. "He'll recover." "You and Dot rode out together?" "Yes." Something settled in his face. "How was that?" "Useful." Meg looked at him steadily. "She's capable in a crisis. She didn't panic, didn't offer opinions on my methods, handed me what I needed." She paused. "I like her. I know she's still deciding about me, but I like her." Sam looked at her for a long moment, with that expression she'd come to recognize as Sam being moved by something he hadn't expected to be moved by. "She hasn't let anyone in since her husband died," he said quietly. 2 years. She came back here and she built everything around this place. And she stopped letting people get close because letting people close meant losing them." He looked at his hands. "We're alike that way, I suppose." "Yes," Meg said. "You are." He heard the full weight of it. "I was afraid of losing the ranch, after Victoria. I was so focused on rebuilding it that I forgot the ranch was supposed to be the means to something, not the thing itself." He moved carefully from the window to the chair behind the desk. The first time she'd seen him behind the desk, and it suited him in a way that the sickbed never had. "You called it. Week 1. I've been sitting upstairs thinking about it ever since." "I know. I could hear you thinking. It's a quiet house." He made a sound that was almost a laugh. "Meg, I need to tell you something." She sat down across from him. "All right." "Crow came to see me this morning, while you were at the Aldersons." Her attention sharpened. "What did he want?" "The same thing he always wants, dressed in a different coat." Sam's voice was even, but she could see the set of his jaw. "He told me he'd heard concerns from members of the community about the situation here. A woman living at the ranch, unmarried, without clear status." He met her eyes. "He was suggesting it was affecting my reputation. And yours." Meg was quiet for a moment. "He's accelerating," she said. "What?" "I told Dot last week that he'd stop being quiet soon." She folded her hands on the desk. "What exactly did he say?" "That people were talking. That in a community like Bridger Creek, appearances matter for a ranch of this standing. That if my intentions toward you were honorable, the situation should be formalized, for your protection as much as mine." Sam's eyes were steady. He made it sound like concern. It wasn't concern. No, it was a deadline. Meg thought about Crow's face when she told him the ranch wasn't selling parcels. The recalibration. The departure that felt like a repositioning. He wants you pressured into a decision before you've recovered enough to think clearly. A man convalescing is a man whose judgment is negotiable. She looked at Sam. "What did you tell him?" "I told him my intentions and my timeline were my own business, and he was welcome to convey that to anyone who had expressed concern." A pause. "He didn't love that." "No," Meg said. "He wouldn't." She stood and walked to the window where he'd been standing, not because she needed to see out of it, but because she needed to think in a direction that wasn't his face. "Sam, what he's doing, the community pressure, the reputation talk, that's a lever. He's found a place to put it, and he's going to keep pushing." She turned. "What does he actually want? The Collins parcel? or something bigger? Sam was quiet. The Collins parcel is the first piece, he said slowly. If a developer from Bozeman comes in and buys it through Crow as intermediary, and the town council approves the use, which Crow controls, it sets a precedent. Other small parcels follow. Eventually, he has enough leverage to push for a rail stop. He looked at the window. A rail stop changes the value of every piece of land in this valley. Including yours. Including mine. Either I sell at his timeline and price, or I'm surrounded by development I didn't choose, and my ranch becomes an island. His jaw tightened. He's been patient. I'll give him that. 5 years he's been positioning. And he decided now is the time because you're in bed with broken ribs, and there's an unmarried woman in your house who can be made into a scandal if needed? Meg came back to the desk. He didn't account for the woman having opinions about it. No, Sam said, and the corner of his mouth moved. He didn't. We need to understand exactly what he has on the town council, and who on it might be persuadable. She pulled the ledger that was sitting on the corner of the desk toward her, not asking permission, because asking permission for the thing she was about to do would have made it a favor instead of a contribution. Show me the property map. Sam looked at her for a long moment. Then he reached into the desk drawer and put the property survey on the desk between them, and they bent over it together, and Meg discovered that Sam Harte had the same quality her father had possessed. The ability to think about a problem without needing to win the thinking, which was rarer than it should have been, and worth more than he probably knew. They were still at the desk when Dot came in an hour later with coffee she hadn't been asked to make, and set it down without comment, and looked at the survey spread between them and said, "Crow's been talking to Gerald Finch at the land office. I heard it from Marcus's wife this morning." Sam looked up. "Finch is on the council." "Finch has a note coming due in April that Crow's bank holds," Dot said. She sat down in the third chair with her own cup, entirely naturally, as if the three of them had been working at this desk for years. "I've known it for 6 months." I didn't say anything because I didn't have proof of what Crow intended to do with it. Meg looked at her. "But you know now." "I know that a man who visits 4 times in 2 weeks and makes conversation about community suppers and developers from Bozeman is not visiting out of pastoral devotion." Dot held her gaze. "And I know that when Gerald Finch has a note coming due, he votes the way the note holder suggests." "That's 2 votes on a 5-man council," Sam said. "Wallace Reed makes 3, Dot said. "His daughter wants to marry a boy whose father owes Crow's church a significant sum. Reed won't cross him." She paused. "I've been watching this for a long time, Sam. I didn't know what he was building toward until recently." The room was quiet. "Why didn't you tell me?" Sam asked. Dot looked at her brother with the specific patience of a woman who had said a version of this before and knew how it ended. "Because you were building the ranch back up after Victoria, and you didn't need another fight, and I thought I could manage it." A pause. "I was wrong about the last part." Sam held her gaze, then quietly, "Dot, I'm sorry I put that on you." It was 4 words, and they landed like something much heavier. Dot looked at her coffee. "You didn't put it on me. I picked it up." She turned the cup in her hands. "That's what I do." The silence that followed was the kind that came between people who loved each other and had been careful with each other for so long that being careless, even gently, felt like an exposure. Meg sat still and let it be what it was. Then Dot looked at her. "What do you know about council politics?" "I know that Cincinnati's hospital board was 12 men who each wanted something different, and I learned to work them by finding what they were actually afraid of, rather than what they said they wanted." Meg set down her cup. "What does Crow want that isn't land?" Dot and Sam looked at each other. "Legitimacy," Sam said slowly. He came out here 10 years ago from back east. Nobody knows exactly why he left. He's been building a reputation here as the moral center of the community. A man people trust with their troubles and their money. He paused. Land is the means. What he actually wants is to be the man who built this valley. Then we don't fight the land question, Meg said. We fight the legitimacy question. Dot looked at her. How? We find out why he left back east. Meg looked at Sam. You have a contact in Bozeman? Someone who moves in commercial circles, who might have connections further east? Jackson Hollis. He's a land agent, knows everybody. Can you write to him today? Sam reached for paper without hesitation. Meg watched him and felt the particular satisfaction of a problem that had shifted from something being done to someone into something being engaged directly, which was the only kind of satisfaction she entirely trusted. Dot watched Sam writing. Then she looked at Meg. You're not what I expected, she said, not warmly, factually. I know. Victoria was charming. She made everyone feel good about themselves. She was easy to be around. Dot paused. You're not charming. You're not easy to be around. No, Meg agreed. But you're here. Dot held her gaze. You came here in a snowstorm, and you stitched him up, and you stayed, and you went to the Alderson boy, and you're sitting at this desk working a problem that's been working against this family for 5 years. She stopped. I don't know what that is yet, but it's not what Victoria was. It's not, Meg said. Dot nodded once, the precise nod of a woman updating an assessment. She reached across the desk and moved one of the account books into a position where Meg could see it more easily. The Finch note is in here, she said. The amount and the date. If you're going to understand what Crow can do with it, you should see the numbers. Meg pulled the book toward her. Their hands were close on the page for a moment, and Dot did not move hers away. Sam looked up from his letter and saw them both bent over the account book, and something in his face went quiet and certain and grateful in a way that he didn't try to cover. Jackson will have something for us within the week, he said. Good. Meg ran her finger down the column of figures. In the meantime, we behave exactly as we have been. No visible changes. Crow needs to think he's still moving on his own timeline. And when Crow's past comes back? Dot asked. Then we have a conversation with 3 council members privately, before he can frame it publicly. Meg looked up. He's been patient for 5 years because he's been moving in the dark. We bring him into the light. His patience won't hold. The fire in the study crackled. Outside the window, the ranch moved through its afternoon. Horses and men, and the ordinary business of a working property. Sam sealed his letter and set it aside for Marcus to take to town, and Dot refilled all 3 cups without being asked, which was the first time she had done that, and the significance of it moved through the room without anyone acknowledging it, which was exactly right. They worked until the light went. All 3 of them, at the same desk, each doing the part they were built for. It was the first time in 2 weeks that Meg felt the shape of something that might, eventually, with work and honesty and the specific stubbornness of 3 people who had each survived something that should have finished them, become what she'd come 2,000 miles to find. Not a rescue, not a romance, something more durable than either, a partnership. She kept her eyes on the numbers and did not say it out loud, because some things were better earned than declared. But she thought it. Jackson Hollis's letter arrived on a Wednesday, 9 days after Sam had written to him. Marcus brought it from town with the morning supplies and set it on the desk without comment, which meant he'd heard something in town worth not commenting on, which meant Crow was moving. Sam opened it with Meg and Dot on either side of him. Hollis had written 2 pages in the compressed, efficient hand of a man who understood that information was currency and wasted neither. Elias Crow had come west from Philadelphia 11 years ago. He had been, in Philadelphia, not a reverend, but a financial broker, a legitimate one, until a series of land investment schemes collapsed and took with them the savings of 14 families who had trusted him with money they could not afford to lose. No criminal charges had been filed, a fact Hollis underlined twice, because 2 of those families had been prominent enough to prefer quiet resolution over public scandal. Crow had left Philadelphia 6 months after the last scheme failed. He had arrived in Montana as a reverend, ordained by a small denomination that Hollis described as having minimal requirements for verification. The room was quiet for a long moment after Sam finished reading. "He's done this before," Dot said. "The whole thing. The trust, the positioning, the land." "Different method," Meg said. "In Philadelphia, he used paper investments. Here he's using a church and a town council." She looked at Sam. "Same instinct. Find what people want to believe about themselves and give it to them until they can't afford to stop." "Gerald Finch wants to believe he's a respectable man," Sam said slowly. "Wallace Reed wants to believe he's a good father." He set the letter down. Crow gave them both a way to feel like the community was better for having them in it. And all it cost them was their votes. Meg picked up the letter and read through it again, more slowly. "The families in Philadelphia. Does Hollis name them?" "2 of them. A Hartwell family and a Brennan." Meg looked up. "Hartwell? As in the Hartwell Mercantile Company?" Sam looked at her sharply. "You know them?" "My father treated Edward Hartwell's youngest son for 3 summers. The family had money and connections from here to Washington." She set the letter down carefully. "If even one of those families is willing to put their name to what happened in Philadelphia, Crow doesn't have a quiet problem. He has a loud one." Dot was watching her. "You think Hollis can reach them?" "I think Hollis reached far enough to find this. Whether the Hartwells want to revisit an 11-year-old embarrassment is a different question." Meg turned to Sam. "But we may not need them to speak publicly. We may only need Crow to know that we know, and that we have a line to people who could speak if asked." Sam looked at her for a moment. "That's a warning, not an exposure." "Yes. You're giving him a chance to leave." "I'm giving him a reason to leave that doesn't require a public fight, that damages 3 families on the town council, and disrupts this community for a year." She met his eyes. "Unless you'd rather the fight." Sam was quiet. "No," he said finally. "I'd rather he was gone." He paused. "I'd rather it was done." "Then we do it once, clearly, and we do it privately." Meg looked at Dot. "Can you arrange for Crow to come to the ranch tomorrow, without making it seem like a confrontation?" Dot's expression was the expression she wore when she was several steps ahead and was waiting to see if anyone else would catch up. "I'll tell him Sam wants to discuss the community supper arrangements personally. He's been trying to get a meeting with Sam alone for 2 weeks. He'll come." "Good." Meg folded the letter. "And I want Marcus in the house." Dot nodded. "I'll tell him he's fixing the study door." The door to the study was not broken, and all 3 of them knew it, and none of them said so. Crow arrived the following afternoon at 2 o'clock, which was precisely when he'd said he would arrive, because men who wanted to be seen as trustworthy were punctual about it. He came in with his hat and his pleasant expression and his pastoral ease, and he sat across the desk from Sam, who was behind the desk, no longer a man confined to bed, recovered enough that the room had shifted back into its proper configuration, and he began, as he always began, with warmth. "Samuel, it's good to see you on your feet. You look well." His eyes moved to Meg, who was sitting in the chair to Sam's right, with the account ledger open in her lap, as though she'd simply been working there when he arrived, which she had. Miss Calloway. He glanced toward the door, where the sound of Marcus's unhurried work on a hinge that needed no work was audible. I understood this was to be a private meeting. Marcus is fixing the door, Sam said. And Miss Calloway is working on the accounts. She's been managing them since I've been recovering. I've asked her to stay. Crow looked at Meg for a moment. Then he looked back at Sam and let the warmth settle into its professional register. Of course. I wanted to speak with you about the Collins parcel, actually. The developer from Bozeman is still interested, and I think if we could arrange a meeting before the new year— That's not what I wanted to talk about, Sam said. Crow paused. A fractional pause, but Meg was watching for it. Oh? I had a letter from Jackson Hollis. Sam folded his hands on the desk. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. He sends his regards, by the way. He mentioned he has associates in Philadelphia who remember you. From before Montana. The room did not change. The fire still burned. Marcus still worked at the door hinge, with the unhurried patience of a man who had all the time in the world. But Elias Crow went very still, in the way of a man who has been walking in the dark and has just understood that the people in the room have been able to see him the whole time. I'm not sure what you mean, he said. I think you are, Sam said. I think you're sure of exactly what I mean. I think you came here 11 years ago because Philadelphia had become inconvenient, and you built something here that worked on the same principle as what you built there. Find what people need to believe and give it to them. His voice remained even. The difference is that this is my valley, and these are my neighbors, and I've spent 20 years building something here that belongs to them as much as it belongs to me. Crow looked at him. Then he looked at Meg, and the pleasantness was entirely gone now, replaced by a colder and more honest expression that was, in its way, more interesting than the performance had been. You've been busy, Miss Calloway. I've been working, Meg said. It's the same thing. And what is it you want? Crow asked. He was looking at Sam, but the question was for both of them. Money? I don't want your money, Sam said. I want you to release Gerald Finch's note. Full forgiveness of the debt, documented and filed at the land office. I want the same done for the obligation Wallace Reed's family carries. He paused. And then I want you to go. Go, Crow repeated. I want you gone from Bridger Creek before the spring thaw. Sam's voice was flat and final. There are other towns in Montana that don't know the name Elias Crow yet. I'd suggest you get to one of them before the Hartwell family decides that 11 years is long enough to stay quiet. The silence was complete. Then Crow made a sound that was almost a laugh, the compressed, humorless sound of a man reconsidering everything he'd assessed about a situation. You could have ruined me publicly, he said. Why didn't you? Because this community doesn't need that, Sam said. Because Gerald Finch has a family, and Wallace Reed has a daughter, and neither of them are bad men. They're just men who were afraid of something and made a poor choice about who to trust with their fear. His eyes were steady. That's not worth a public spectacle. Crow looked at him for a long moment. Then he looked at Meg again. And you? What do you get from this? The same thing Sam gets, she said. A community where the people can trust each other, without someone quietly arranging that trust to point in one direction. She closed the account ledger. And I'd like you to stop visiting this ranch. That would be a personal kindness I'd appreciate. Crow stood. He picked up his hat. He turned it in his hands for a moment, looking at it the way men looked at objects when they were assembling themselves back into the shape they needed to be. Then he looked at Sam. You're a harder man than you look, he said. I'm exactly as hard as I need to be, Sam said. Not more. Crow left. Marcus watched him go from the doorway and then came fully into the room, and looked at Sam with the steady expression of a man who had served this ranch for 12 years and was prepared to serve it for 12 more. "He going?" "He's going," Sam said. Marcus nodded once. "Good." He picked up his tools and walked out, and his footsteps down the hall were the footsteps of a man who had no further concerns about the matter. Dot appeared in the doorway 2 minutes later. She looked at Sam. She looked at Meg. "Done?" "Done," Meg said. Dot came in and sat down in the third chair, the one that had become hers over the past weeks of evenings at this desk, and she picked up her own account book and opened it, and the three of them sat in the study in the winter afternoon quiet and worked, and it was the most ordinary thing that had happened in this house in years, and all three of them understood that its ordinariness was the point. An hour later, Sam set down his pen and looked at Meg. She felt the look before she saw it, the particular quality of attention that meant he had been thinking towards something for a while and had arrived. "Meg," she looked up, "I want to ask you something." He glanced at Dot, who turned a page of her account book with perfect serenity and did not look up. Sam looked back at Meg. Not a test, not a strategy, just a question. "All right," Meg said. "Are you staying?" The question was clean and simple and had none of the elaborate architecture of his earlier attempts at it. No conditions attached, no hedging, just the honest, undefended version of what he actually needed to know. Meg looked at him. She thought about a telegram in a Cincinnati kitchen and a carpet bag on a narrow bed and a brother who shook her hand at a train station like she was a business acquaintance resolving itself. She thought about a snowstorm and a man bleeding in the snow who had looked at her with gray eyes that already knew her face. She thought about 3 weeks of mornings changing dressings and evenings at this desk, and a woman across a kitchen table who had moved an account book 3 inches so Meg could read the numbers, and the weight of what that small movement contained. She thought about being useful to people who were ashamed to admit it, and about being useful here, in this house, in this valley, to people who were not ashamed of anything except the wrong they'd done and were working daily to correct. "Yes," she said. "I'm staying." Sam held her gaze. "Because of the ranch? Because Crow is handled and the situation is stable and it's practical to—" "Because of you," she said. "Because of Dot. Because of Marcus and Doc Briggs and Martha Alderson and Henry, who is going to make a full recovery and already sent me a drawing of a horse that I have put in my room." She held Sam's gaze. "Because this place fits the shape of what I was looking for, in a way I didn't know how to describe until I was already in it." She paused. "And because you wrote me 17 letters over 4 months, and every single one of them was true. And a man who can be that true in his writing is a man worth the work of learning in person." Sam looked at her for a long moment. "Even with everything I did wrong. Everything you did wrong brought me to a line shack in a blizzard where I had to decide in 3 hours whether you were worth staying for." She held his gaze. "You were worth staying for, Sam. You just needed to get out of your own way long enough for me to see it." He exhaled. The tension that had been in him since the morning, since longer than the morning, she thought, since longer than she'd known him, went out of him in one slow, controlled breath. Like a man setting down something he'd been carrying for so long, he'd forgotten it was weight. "I have something to ask you," he said. "Something I should have asked 3 weeks ago. Something I should have asked before you ever got on a train." He reached into the desk drawer and set a small box on the desk between them. "I wrote to Doc Briggs's wife about your mother. She wrote to a colleague in Cincinnati who knew your family. Your father's birthstone was sapphire." He looked at her. "I wanted you to have something that connected to him, to the man who taught you everything that saved my life." Meg looked at the box. She did not move immediately. She sat with the weight of it for a moment, the specific weight of a man who had learned from his mistakes not by becoming less himself, but by becoming more honest, who would ask the right questions instead of making the right assumptions, who would work to understand what mattered to her rather than what he thought should matter. She opened the box. A ring, gold and plain, with a single sapphire set simply. Not elaborate, not the ring of a man trying to impress, the ring of a man who had listened. "Margaret Calloway," Sam said. His voice was steady and unhurried and entirely his. "I let you walk into a blizzard because I was afraid of being wrong about you. You turned out to be the person I was most right about in my entire life." He held her gaze. "I am asking you to marry me. Not because you came 2,000 miles, not because it's expected, not because it's practical, though it is practical, and I know you appreciate that. I'm asking you because I have spent 20 years building something I am only just beginning to understand was always meant to be shared. And I cannot think of a single person I would rather share it with than the woman who stitched me up in a snowstorm and told me the truth before she even knew my name." Dot turned another page of her account book. Meg looked at Sam across the desk. She looked at the ring. She looked at his face, which was the face of a man who had run out of distance between himself and the thing he wanted, and was simply standing in the open, honest and undefended, waiting. "Yes," Meg said. "I'll marry you." Sam reached across the desk and took her hand. She let him. Dot closed her account book with a decisive sound and stood up. "I'm going to tell Mrs. Alderson. She'll want to know before anyone else does. And if Bridger Creek finds out through the trading post before Martha Alderson hears it from someone at this ranch, I will not forgive either of you." She walked to the door. Then she stopped, her back to them, her hand on the doorframe. "Meg." "Yes?" A pause. "I'm glad you walked instead of waiting." She left before either of them could respond, and her footsteps down the hall were the footsteps of a woman who had said the thing she meant and didn't need to stand around watching it land. Sam looked at Meg. "That's the most she's said to you that wasn't about account books or fence repairs." "I know." Meg looked at the door. "I know what it cost her." He looked down at her hand in his. Then he said, quietly, "I want you to run the medical practice, formally. Doc Briggs has been asking for a partner for 2 years. I want it to be you, with your name on the door, with the compensation and the recognition that 3 years in Cincinnati didn't give you." Meg went still. "I'm not offering it as a wedding gift," Sam said. "I'm offering it because you are the best doctor in this valley, and everybody in it knows it, and it's past time the valley acknowledged it." He met her eyes. "You told me you spent 3 years keeping men alive while someone else took credit. I will not let that happen here. Not on this ranch, not in this valley, not while I have anything to say about it." She looked at him for a long moment, and the thing she felt was not the soft, obliterating feeling of romantic stories. It was something cleaner and stronger than that. The specific feeling of being seen accurately, completely, without the softening of sentiment or the distortion of need. The feeling of a person who has been looked at honestly and found worthy, not in spite of what she was, but because of it. "All right," she said. "All right," he agreed. Outside, the valley held its winter quiet, and the mountains stood where they had always stood, patient and enormous and indifferent to the particular dramas of the people in their shadow. The ranch went on doing what it always did. Horses in the corral, men at their work, smoke from the kitchen chimney, the ordinary and irreplaceable business of a life being lived. Inside, 2 people sat at a desk in the long afternoon light, hands linked across the account books and the property surveys and the accumulated paperwork of a ranch that had been built by one person for 20 years and would be built by two people for 20 more. Not because the story demanded it, not because it was the ending anyone had planned, but because they had each, in their own way, been honest about what they needed and had found, against considerable odds and through considerable stupidity and courage and blizzard weather, that they needed the same thing. Margaret Calloway had come 2,000 miles for a stranger's promise and found something better. A man who had stopped making promises and started telling the truth. And in the cold, unforgiving, indescribably beautiful country of the Montana Territory, in the winter of 1878, she put down every last thing she had been running from, and picked up, with both hands and her whole stubborn heart, everything she had been running toward. She was no longer a guest. She was no longer invisible. She was no longer a woman waiting to be chosen. She had chosen the land, the work, the man, and above all, herself. And that choice, made freely and at full cost, and with her eyes completely open, was the only thing she had ever owned that no one could take from her. She was home. And this time, she had built it herself.